Welcome to the Tools for the Modern Man podcast. I'm Pete Beskis, your host, and today I have my guest Frank Burgoyne on, and he is an interview success coach, and you can find him at yourinterviewsuccess.com. I brought Frank on today because it's part of my series for, kind of looking for new opportunities and how you can go and utilize your skills, whether it was your resume, whether it was, going to your network. And I brought Frank on because we had an amazing conversation as it pertains to interviews and interview success. And no better to have on board this podcast than an expert in that industry or in that field. So, Frank, thank you so much for being on board today.
Keith, thanks so much for having me. And maybe I'd just start off by telling you a little bit about myself. As Pete mentioned, I'm an interview success coach. And, I started this business about 7 years ago because I had been a recruiter here in the San Francisco Bay Area for 14 years. And during that time, I interviewed well over 10,000 candidates. And I just saw so many talented people as far as their resume, their work history, academic credentials, but they really were poor at interviewing. And as a recruiter, my hands were really tied. I wasn't really allowed to, give them any tips. And so for a long time, I really wanted to start this business. And 7 years ago, I finally did. And it really kind of took off from the start. Turns out a lot of people who are highly accomplished aren't necessarily always that great at interviews, or maybe they're just not feeling that confident, at this time because they've gone through a lot of rejection.
You know what? It's funny because I remember starting off in my career, 25 years ago, graduating from university and being unemployed for 13 months in a down economy, fresh out of school, not having any experience. And then as I got older and as I got more confident in my skill set, interviewing became almost a breeze. What would you say are like the top mistakes you see? Let's just top 3, 4 mistakes that you see that people have when they are approaching interviews?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the biggest problems, and it doesn't matter whether you're a recent grad or you're executive level or beyond, people often are just too vague in their interview answers. And, today companies really, really want to kind of take you off the stage by using behavioral interview questions. And those simply are the kinds of questions where, tell me about a time when you had to solve a complex problem. And companies expect candidates to really have their answers be in the STAR format, which is situation, task, action, and result. Used to be kind of a nice to have if you answered that way, but companies, both big and small, are really demanding it now. And so that's one of the problems. People are too vague, and they don't really put their answers into the STAR approach. I think the other thing that I'm seeing a lot of right now is people who are maybe over 45 and they're finding it just harder to move forward in their interviews, and they're kind of confused about it because they never had that problem before, or maybe they didn't really even have to do much interviewing. They always had really great referrals that were kind of opening the door for them. And now, a referral is always an advantage. It's always going to be a better way to be interviewing with a company, but they're still going to put you through these long interview processes. And so I think that's one of the big changes now. And not everybody's ready for it. They don't really have a plan. And a lot of people just don't know what they're doing wrong because companies aren't going to tell you. They don't want to be sued.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of challenges that I think are unique to this job market. It's not that there aren't a lot of great jobs available, but it's not going to be like an easy ride going through the interview process.
And do you think that that's fair to say now across, like, we hear a lot of people right now are being laid off in one industry, and I think it's tech. You're seeing a lot of people getting laid off, huge layoffs. But then there's other industries, and I think this is an interesting question I want to pose to you from your point of view. If you're a person who has 20, 15 years plus experience in one specific, niche, right? Whether it's tech, I come from oil and gas. to be able to pivot themselves into a new arena or to a new kind of genre, how would they go about doing that if that's where their confidence and their kind of speaking points are built on?
Yeah, I think that I think almost everybody either wants to get into the tech industry, or they're thinking about getting into the tech industry. And honestly, it's not that you can't make it's not that you can't transfer your skills from another industry and land a great job in tech. But again, it's going to require preparation. You've got to make it really easy for that company to see that you have the right skills, you have the right successes. Sure, there's going to be some learning curve, but that you've got it what it takes. You've got the right attitude. You have a track record of success, and so it's really incumbent on you to be able to show up in those interviews and really prove your value proposition. It's just not enough to have a great resume, and yourself, you have a lot of success. You've really got to make it kind of easy for that hiring manager to think that you can come in here and hit the ground running. Everybody's got things to learn in a new job, but is it going to take 6 months of hand holding before you can really, start to perform? That's what we want to avoid.
Yeah. So from your experience, both on the side when you were recruiting and interviewing people, and now when you coach people, what are the three things that make that impression when you walk into that interview room for the first time? What is it that person's looking for? What?
I think the very first thing is what we call executive presence, or your gravitas, and that simply starts off with eye contact. All of the interviews are still being conducted pretty much by video.
Mhm.
And so sometimes the first thing I do with a client is make sure that, that they're looking in the camera if they're on their laptop, and, that they're making direct eye contact. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, how are you responding to a question like, tell me about yourself, or take me through your resume? That's usually the first question. And it's very key, because you don't want to be in a situation where your answer lands kind of weak, and that person interviewing you is kind of feeling like, I don't know about this person, because impressions are made so quickly in interviews. You
Mhm.
know, all kinds of training is done on helping hiring managers not have implicit bias, but we have it irregardless. And so, what you want to accomplish when you're responding to tell me about yourself is you want that hiring manager to say, God, I'm really glad we brought Pete in today. I'm excited to hear more. What you don't want to happen is, I don't know about this guy. He's really vague. He's not resonating. I don't know if he's going to fit here. And
Sure.
that's all happening subconsciously. So you want to have a great answer to that question.
What are some of the things to avoid? Like, when you get asked that question, what are some of the, red flags as someone who is on the other side of the table when you hear it come out of someone's mouth?
There's two extremes. There's that person, they're interviewing like for an executive level position, and their answer to tell me about yourself is 30 seconds. That's not enough. That's not enough for a recent college grad. But I think there's a fear like, well, I don't want to be too long. Well, you can be too short too.
Mhm.
And the other thing is, you're instead of really giving us a sense of like, how have you made a difference? You want to throw in a couple successes into that, into your narrative, your answer to tell me about yourself. You don't want it to be many people, even again, executive level. They are just simply regurgitating like a job description. I oversaw, X number of people, and and blah 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 about what they were doing, but it reads like a job description. Instead, it's like, I'm really proud of this accomplishment. We were able to expand our market overseas, doing X, Y, and Z. We landed a new product, and then immediately that hiring manager or whoever's interviewing them is like, oh, I want to hear more. Wow, this person got some things done.
This is interesting to me because there's this book called Everything is Sales, right? Or Sales is Everything. And most of us, especially technical people, engineers, computer science people, geologists, even any scientist, any medical person, we were never taught how to sell anything, right? And an interview is a sales pitch. It's a sales pitch to hire your services. And one of the things that, I think we always talk about is like the one thing, like what's your one liner? What's your elevator pitch? How do you get someone to ask that question? Tell me more, to prompt them to do that. So when you're working with somebody, how do you craft that with them?
Yeah, there's really not, first of all, I want to say there's not one way to respond to tell me about yourself. There's not one way to do a resume, but there are some key components that I think need to be there. Sometimes just remembering to start with a thank you. Many people just boom, go in. It's like, especially by video, you haven't shaken their hand. So in a way, you want to start with, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. The next thing I think that really lands well is to say something about your excitement about the company. Instead of me, talk a little bit about the company and your excitement to be there. And then, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking they have to tell their whole life story. Chances are we're interviewing you because of your most recent experience. So you can give a career overview that's, a few sentences, but then land your plane in your current job. Don't start back at college. We don't want to hear about college. You've got 20 years of experience. It's almost irrelevant now. Start where you are, and then you can move back. But it's not a confessional. You don't have to talk about everything on your resume. So selectively talk about things, accomplishments that company's going to be interested in.
Yeah. No, I love that too, because it puts that position where it's a conversation. I think a lot of us are better in a conversational setting than in an interview setting, right? Because, we ask about another person. This is like being on a first date. How do you, tell me a little bit about yourself. Oh, I'll tell, and the key accomplishments. That's something that we talked about in our previous podcast about highlighting what you're really proud of versus telling every minutia detail that you have of every project you've ever worked on, which again, technical people, they're the worst for that, right? I don't know how many engineers you worked with, Frank, but you talk to one engineer and they'll tell you in excruciating detail what they're working on.
Well, and it's interesting because engineers often have 5-6 page resumes.
Mm-hmm.
And also are kind of clueless that nobody wants a resume that long. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
No one has time to read that. But
how does that translate when in person? Let's say they meet that, that's a sit. Is that okay? Fine, somebody cleaned up their resume for them, but how do you own it? How do you is it the repetition? Is it having another set of eyes on it? Is it like practice?
I think it is practice, but what I find is often senior level people, they want to write out an answer to tell me about yourself, and some of them want to have it on their desktop, and they're literally reading it during the video interview. And what you don't realize is we know you're reading, and we don't like it. Mm-hmm. You're breaking that connection. We're not just interviewing you for your skills. We're trying to figure out, can you lead people in this culture? Are you going to fit in here? So if you're acting kind of robotic and you're searching for answers on your desktop and you're reading them, you're going to lose that kind of connection. So that's another critical component.
I think you raised a really, really good point here. There's what can you do for the company in terms of your skill set? Like how do you elevate this position? But I think another one you nailed was definitely the how do you lead and how do you show up in the culture, and that connection being so important. Because I know when I would interview for somebody, at some level, 10, 15, 20 years, the skill sets are a lot similar. Like you're getting a lot of the same skill sets across the board. I'm looking and was looking for a match. Are you going to work well with the team? Are you going to mesh? You know, are you asking the right questions? So let's lead into that, which is asking the right questions. So if I'm now answering the right questions, well, how do I ask the right questions for a potential
Yeah.
company?
Asking questions is something that is actually really critical in this job market, asking the right questions. Because if you're asking questions, you know, it's really almost a waste if you're using the question and answer portion to ask questions about things that you could have done research about.
Mhm.
And you're gonna and what that's gonna do is you're going to lose points because they're gonna feel like, why is this guy asking me, you know, if we're gonna expand into China when, you know, there's 100 articles about it on Google. Clearly, they didn't do any research. So you want to ask a question that's going to continue the dialogue. You don't want to just be, I ask a question, you give me an answer, I go on to my next question. You want to ask questions that are going to kind of continue the conversation and enable you to continue to add value. You're still being interviewed during the Q&A. So if you ask a question like, tell me about the kind of challenges I'm going to be meeting in this position on day one. And then that hiring manager probably gladly tells you what's going on there. Well, instead of going to the next question, of course, you'd want to say, you know, that's interesting, especially that challenge you mentioned. Let me tell you when I did that, and then go into your answer. And you're adding value even during the Q&A. So the kinds of questions you ask, you really want to think about that and try to keep them open-ended and to give you potential opportunities to continue to talk about what you're bringing to the table.
That's great. So I'm going to ask you now, just for my
Yeah.
audience, because I got you on here. What is a showstopper question that you can keep in your toolbox for any interview you're in?
I think actually the one I just mentioned is one of my favorites. And again, that question is, tell me about the problems that I will be facing in this position. What are some of the challenges
Mhm.
that, you know, the person who's going to be hired are going to basically be handed from day one? And there's always going to be challenges. If
Yeah.
that person says there's no challenges, you probably don't want that job. So, you know, that's a really good question, and you know, there. I think you know that you have a good question when it's going to lead to more discussion. Asking the question, tell me about the culture. That's a dumb question because again, you should have done some research. You should already go on Glassdoor, read about the culture. Google the company name. What's the culture like? There's all kinds of information. You've kind of wasted that person's time with that question.
Mhm.
And also, when you're asking about the culture, subtly you're looking out for yourself. You know, it's kind of like, I want to make sure your culture fits me. Well, really what you want to be doing in the interview, and the culture is important. You know, don't get me wrong, do your research, find out about the culture if it's a fit for you. But really, by the time you get to that interview, you should know a bit about the culture, and you want to be always adding value. You always, you know, that's why at the beginning you want to kind of say at the beginning of the interview, I'm really excited about interviewing for Google or whoever because I noticed this and this, and you know that, or there's a challenge that was talked about in that job description. That's exactly the kind of challenge I want and I feel I could contribute to. You want to be a go-giver. You know, you really want to convey that I'm here, I want to give to you, I want to contribute, I can bring success. Not, I want a certain culture, I need a certain salary. Those are all important, but it's not, the interview's not the time for it.
Yeah. So really, and I think that's a mistake like a lot of people make is asking about how much vacation do I get? How much, what's my salary going to be? Like, negotiate that when they make you an offer versus,
Absolutely. And usually a lot of that you can ask the recruiter that if you want to.
yeah,
And for example, in the state of California, the salary ranges now by law have to be posted in the job description. So already you've got at least some information about the range, although I notice the ranges are often quite broad.
yeah,
So
they're covering their butts on that one.
yeah.
What do you do? Yeah, how do you coach people when either there's a gap in their resume or they're applying for something that there's a gap in the position that they don't have a skill set for?
Yeah, those are good questions. So when you've got a gap in your resume, the one thing you want to be able to talk about is what you were doing during that gap. So, you don't, people always think that companies want to hear about all their travels. They don't. We don't want to hear about your travels. What we would like to hear, and it's the question behind the question. Why are we asking that question? We want to know, are you ready? You took a year off. Are you ready now to get working? Or is it going to take you 3 months to kind of get going?
Mhm.
So if you're able to talk about, during my time off, in addition to my job search, I got this certification, or I took this class, or I was involved with this networking group, or even some kind of a challenging volunteer opportunity. But we don't want to hear you took a year off to be with family, even though that's true. You got to have more than that. So that's how you can handle that. Now, in regards to when you don't quite match all of the requirements of the position, number one, most of us don't. Most people don't meet every single requirement in a job description. Now, you're going to need to meet most of them. But for example, let's say you don't have a particular technical skill that was in the requirements, and they asked you directly, have you used? Why can't I think of one right now? Do you have experience, using a particular coding or whatever? And you don't have it. You want to be honest and say, no, I don't have that. But let me tell you about another tool I had to learn really quickly. And then tell them how you learned that quickly. That's going to be a much better answer than just saying, oh, I don't have that. Especially if we were really interested in you,
Mhm.
if you're able, and further, you can say, I'm willing to go through that certification. If this job's offered to me, I'm willing to learn that before I start. I'll do that on my own time, no problem. Well, I'm probably gonna be open to hiring that person because I like their attitude.
Yeah. And, to kind of follow up on that, like I'm big into leadership. I coach on leadership and I coach men on different, ways that they can show up. Most of us who are in that late, after 40 kind of thing, the positions technically kind of cap out and you transition to more of that leader managerial type approach. Now, if you're a person who their whole career has been technical and now they're wanting to up level, how do they show, or what are some ways that they can show leadership? They haven't had that experience.
That I would say that's one of my biggest niches right now. I'm working with a lot of senior engineering managers, or people that want to get to that level, and they're starting to interview, but they haven't really managed people. So it's that catch 22. How do you become a manager, if you haven't managed people? But what I do with them is we really spend time thinking about times where they managed a team, maybe an ad hoc team, a project, a program, and really be able to communicate. Maybe you didn't have direct reports, but you've got stories to tell, hopefully, where you have managed projects and teams. You've got to work with what you have. You can't be focused on what you don't have, because that's really going to screw up your mindset.
Mhm.
And the reality is that person interviewing you, they probably needed to fill that yesterday and they want to hire somebody. So when you act ambitious, when you act like, hey, I may not know everything, but I can learn it, or when you pivot to examples where you were a leader, even if you didn't have direct reports, you're going to have a much stronger chance of moving forward in the interview process and even getting an offer. So, so much of it is working with what you have. Because I've had a lot of clients before we really started doing any work, they're kind of stuck thinking, I haven't managed people. And I'm like, really? Really? Tell me about some of your team projects. It's like, yeah, you've managed people. You've had cross-functional management, skills. And those are things we can put into stories and leverage.
So now I know that confidence is built from repetition. So how do you create confidence with your clients going into interviews? Like, let's talk about the confidence component of it.
A lot of people, especially when they've been out there interviewing and they're getting rejected, they start to develop stories. And what I mean by stories are they might have decided I'm too old. I know I'm getting rejected because I'm too old. Or like we just spoke about, they want someone with that particular tool that I don't have. You start to kind of make up these stories and you start to believe the stories. And then you're showing up at the interview, and you may not even be aware of it, but your attitude is off. You may have a lot of resentment that you've had a lot of rejection. So a lot of it for me is uncovering stories. Uncovering stories and helping people see how that's holding them back and creating kind of a fresh start. I'm always talking about I know you've had a lot of rejection, you're angry, you're pissed off, but you know what? Let's have a fresh start here. I've got some new ideas on how you can put your value forth, and you've got to kind of let go of a lot of those stories because the reality is your age is what it is. But if you're not showing up with enthusiasm and you're kind of low energy, well, you're just buying into the stereotype that older people don't have the same energy, right?
Yeah.
And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's understanding that maybe you yourself have baggage you're bringing into the interviews, and we've got to get rid of that baggage first.
So, kind of touched on it a little bit at the aging demographic, right? The demographic, like, probably about 45 up, right? How, what are some of the overall overarching kind of themes that makes that group more attractive than, say, someone who's younger and cheaper, per se?
Yeah, well, certainly experience, and also emotional intelligence, which is becoming a pretty big, buzzword in interviews. Companies are definitely looking for that emotional intelligence. And, it's not to say there are people who are 30 who have a very high emotional intelligence, but, but some of that comes with age, ability to motivate, to inspire people and teams. That's usually a skill that comes later in career. There are exceptions, absolutely.
Yeah. And well, I think that maybe I'll bring up some of the biases then and say, how can someone who, let's say you're in your mid 50s and you're looking for a new position, but there is a bias, just like there are bias generationally, like, oh, those millennials, oh, those Gen Yers, right? That with the older generation, there's stuck in your ways. There is implicit bias. There is, you're used to this old way of doing things, right? So how do you coach somebody to be able to express and show their EQ, right? Because that is something that I think grows as you get older, but it's about counteracting some of those negative bias.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is making sure, and this is the work I do with clients, making sure you have those success stories where you're not just talking about results, but how did you motivate that team? What about a time when you had a team that was very demotivated? Talk about your skill in overturning that. Did you do some kind of one-on-one meetings that were different? Did you have some kind of a team building activity that really kind of turned the corner in the page on people's motivation levels? So you've got to think back, because sometimes it's just hard to remember what you've done, but it's just critical. It's the critical preparation piece for a successful interview. You've got to take the time to really kind of go back and develop those stories. And then, I think you have to get over this idea that, and again, this is kind of the preparation work with attitude that I have to do sometimes with older clients. There's a feeling of like, there's my resume, isn't that enough? I've got 20 plus years of success. I shouldn't have to sit here and defend myself. I don't want to talk about it. And what happens is they have kind of a bad attitude in the interview, and an unwillingness to really even give, an answer in the STAR format. So, and if you keep doing that, you can snowball into kind of a worse hole where no company is going to be interested in you because you're just coming off kind of sour.
You nailed it. You nailed it there with two different points that I want to just come back and highlight. One is the I shouldn't have to do this. Like, well, if you're looking for a job, you kind of do have to do this. Like the shouldn't is one of them. And then the second one, I'll let you expand on this one, is the idea of having to defend yourself in it's not an inquisition, it's an interview. So maybe extrapolate on that a bit.
Yeah, and I had a client in the last year who, we were doing some mock interview practice, and at one point I just stopped the session and I said, "You really hate interviewing, don't you?" I just called it out, and it was good because they said, "Yeah, I do. I'm sick of it. I am sick of interviewing with people who are younger and getting rejected, and I don't think I should have to sell myself. I think it's really clear in my resume." And it was like, thank you for your honesty. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how that is really an impediment right now to your doing well in interviews, because I got to tell you, I feel it. I just feel it as you're answering these questions, like you just are so done with it. And it's not going to lead to a job offer. It's not.
Yeah. And I think that's really important to highlight, is that your mindset going into it and your attitude is critical. It's actually it's more critical than what's on your resume, because people look at the resume, but I think they want to know what's going on with you to bring you in, to make an offer to you. You mentioned this in the beginning. You just mentioned this too, the STAR method. I know you briefly you went through it, but can you just expand a little bit more on what the STAR method is and how people can use it effectively for themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what the advantage of using the STAR method, and the reason companies want answers in the STAR method is because it's very hard to fake your answer when you have to really expound on each component of that STAR. And so, for example, and this is a big problem for a lot of executives. So I will pose a question. Again, this is one of the most popular questions right now companies are using. Tell me about a complex problem that you recently solved. Sounds like a simple question, but the key is recent. We want to know that you're having to do some challenging work recently, right? And the typical executive will start talking about challenging problems in general and how they approach challenging problems. And that's not the STAR method, because it's not specific. And what they're doing is, it's like they're teaching a class in an MBA curriculum, but they're not giving an example of the complex problem. So, the great thing about the STAR, and some people really have a hard time with it, and I'll say, let's start with the situation. What was the situation? Okay. Now, tell me, the next step is task or challenge. Okay, so that was the situation. What was the challenge? We're narrowing it down. What was the challenge? And then actions, the A stands for actions. Actions are how you made a difference. That's where we should see your leadership. That's really critical. And then very often also, even an executive will forget to tell the result. They get so caught up in the actions, and I'll say, and the result was, I forgot to, okay. And then, whenever possible, you want to quantify that result.
Yeah.
But that's a very different answer from just, well, complex problems are the backbone of my job here. And often they involve, cross-functional partners who blah, 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 blah. And they're really telling me nothing. It's nothing.
Yeah, and I think that's thank you for explaining that a little bit further, because that's a process anybody can take with any of their key achievements. Like, take any of your key achievements or your successes and maybe just create a little star profile for each one of those as you're going into job hunting, or even this is great advice to anyone listening, even if they're going into a performance review. They're going into, like, any of these interview skills and interview
Mhm.
questions apply to up leveling even in your current position, right? And taking that star method, applying it, and using it to showcase what you've done for your company and what you can do for a new one.
Well, and the other benefit of a star format is sometimes the company will ask you a question that doesn't ask for a specific story. They might ask you the question, tell me, how do you handle conflict on your team?
Hmm.
Well, no, they didn't ask for a story. But if you pivot to a story, you're always going to have a stronger answer. So just because they didn't ask you for a story doesn't mean you can't tell a story. So instead of saying, "Oh, well, conflict happens often on teams, and I really keep open communication, and my people know," and whereas you could have said, "You know what? Let me tell you about a conflict that happened last week."
Yeah.
And then you tell them very specifically how you handled it. And the more of this you do, you're leaving a lasting impression. There's no way they're going to be able to say um, you were vague in the interview if you're telling these stories consistently.
Okay. So, as we've kind of covered the whole arc of this, but I want to ask you, when you're in an interview, what are some key indicators that you can pick up on whether or not it's going good for you or it's not?
Do you mean the candidate?
If you're the candidate and you're looking at the interviewers.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a little harder by video than in person. Um, and there isn't really one way to look at this, because some people have more of a deadpan approach where they don't want to give you too much. They don't really want you to know that they're really excited and interested in you. So when that happens, you have to realize it doesn't necessarily mean you didn't do well. It might be that person's style. And the same with someone who seems super friendly, and they're saying things like, "Wow, I really like your answer. That was a great answer. That really sounds like you really are sounding like the kind of person I need here." And you feel like, "I got this. I aced it." And then you get a rejection slip. So there isn't always ways to tell whether you're doing well, but in general, you certainly would hope to feel some warmth from that person. If that hiring manager is trained well in how to handle a top candidate, you will have the feeling that they're interested in you. But what I'm saying is, not all of them know that they're supposed to be selling that job to you too.
Okay.
So it can be a little confusing. And I think sometimes candidates, they start a story running that, "Oh, they're not interested in me, so I'm not going to be interested in them either."
Yeah.
I'll
So
show them.
be careful with your mindset going in and thinking that just because you're not getting something back from somebody that they're not interested, they're not engaged. Stick to your points and really just maintain that positive energy.
Well, and I can't tell you how many clients, usually I debrief with my clients after they have a key interview. We talk on the phone because I want to know how it's gone. And often they'll say, you know what? I don't know how I did. I just have no idea. They didn't seem to like me at all. And then the next day, they're moving to the next step.
Yeah.
So you just don't always know. You've got to just be willing to the best of your ability, put your value forth, whether that person's smiling at you or giving you the goodies. Just you got to just always kind of play that game.
Okay. Now, we talked a lot, we covered a lot of stuff, and I really, really appreciate everything that you brought to this conversation, Frank. What's something that we didn't touch on that for you is kind of like critical when you're working with people?
You know, there's a lot of things. I think sometimes people, I think most people know it's a good idea to send a thank you note after a interview, but it's surprising how many people don't. And if we're in a situation, we being the company, if we have two candidates we're kind of equally interested in, we start to parse out, you know, what makes one different. And if that person was always sending a really, you know, great thank you email that, you know, that really just kind of really shined and really expressed their continuing interest, and the email added value, that can start to add up in your favor. So that's one thing people don't do. People often don't tell the company at the end that they really want the job or they're really interested in it. And I've had executives say to me, "Why do I need to do that? I'm sitting here in the interview. They know I'm interested, but they don't necessarily, because that hiring manager now has told you what the job really is, probably different than the job description, or there are some components that are different. We want to know you're still interested. Are you still, you know, are you still really wanting this?" And if you leave and you just kind of say, "Thank you very much," and act like a robot and just, you know, "Thank you very much. I am super excited about this position. I continue to be really confident about what I think I can contribute to it. What's the timeline for the next step?" Well, that's a different ending than just "Thank you so much for the interview."
Yeah, I love that you just added that what's the timeline for the next step, because I think that follow-up allows you also to take a little bit, maybe a little bit more proactiveness in sending your thank you note, in being able to follow up and get an answer. Because it sucks to not
Absolutely.
hear what's going on, right?
Absolutely. And people often don't tell you if you don't ask them what the timeline is for the next step. And again, you're telling them you're interested.
Mhm. No, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Again, you dropped a lot of knowledge here, and I think everyone can piece together, you know, the all the different points, the confidence piece, the star method for answering questions. You know, really, really good quality content here. If somebody wanted to touch base with you, what do you have going on? How can they reach you?
Yeah. Well, again, my website is yourinterviewsuccess.com. Great starting place is for us to have a free Zoom call, where I can really find out more about your goals, and you know, really, because my services are really customized to people's situations and the level of interviews that they're, you know, going to be participating in. So I think it all starts with a conversation.
Excellent. All right. Well, you guys, I'll have all that in the show notes. Again, I want to thank you, Frank, for coming on board, and wishing you all the best and happy holidays.
Thank you so much, Pete, and happy holidays to you as well.
Great. And I will talk to all of you on next week on Tools for the Modern Man podcast. Thanks again.